Hi, everybody. This is Joe Firestone with the In-Depth show. Sorry, I have the wrong screen up. Okay, this is Joe Firestone with the In-Depth show, and I'm here tonight for new macro media. Our topic for tonight will be Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal plan, part two. And part two deals with transforming our energy system. So let's see how we're doing at your end before we start the discussion. Okay, I see Dave Phelps here. Hi, Dave. And Russell Gorman. How are you doing, Russ? And hello, Dolores Pierce. And hello to you, Johnny Axum. And my daughter, Devora. Hi. Jason Bessie is here with us tonight. And also Bonnie Firestone is here, my wife. Hi, Bonnie. How are you? How's my sound? Whoop. There went my camera for no apparent reason. Okay, I'll be a moment till I fix that. Yes, I know. My XSplit is showing. Okay, I think I'm back now. Hopefully it will be steady. And I won't have any more problems. Okay, that looks good. Okay, let's share Bernie's plan now. Sorry about that. Have to adjust the page. That looks good right now. Except that I may be in the wrong corner of the screen. But I think that problem will go away in a moment or two. Anyway, let's see what Bernie has to say, okay, in more detail. Okay, this is section 1 and the detail of section 1. Okay, in yesterday's live stream, I went over the overview of the system. So now we're getting into the detail. And Bernie says there's no reason that we, the U.S., the wealthiest country in the history of the world, though maybe not per capita, can't transform our energy system away from fossil fuels to 100% renewable energy like wind, solar, and geothermal. And he says we have more than enough capacity to produce ample, reliable, affordable electricity from sustainable resources. And the goal is to pass a Green New Deal to achieve 100% sustainable energy for electricity and transportation by no later than 2030, and to fully decarbonize the economy by 2050 at the latest. Now, I think these goals are the most ambitious ones I've seen so far from any presidential candidate. So Bernie points out the federal government was successful, in electrifying America as part of the New Deal. The United States of America, he says, put people on the moon 50 years ago, and his plan says we can sure as hell transform our energy system away from fossil fuels to 100% renewables today and create millions of jobs in the process. And the plan says when Bernie is president, we will act immediately to address our climate crisis. Together, we will reduce U.S. carbon pollution emissions by 71% and emissions among less industrialized countries by 36% from 2017 levels by 2030, consistent with meeting our fair share of emissions reductions under the IPCC's the sorry reductions under the recommendations of the IPCC. These emissions reductions represent the equivalent of reducing our emissions, that is to say, the US's emissions, by 161%. This effort will be enforced by an interagency council led by the Environmental Protection Agency. And then he's got a set, of bullet points. It's a very extensive set. He wants to transform our energy system away from fossil fuels to 100% energy efficiency and sustainable energy by 2030 at the latest. He refers again to what was done under the New Deal. And he mentions the Federal Power Marketing Administrations. There are a number of those today. As we'll see later, there are, I believe, some 6 of them actually right now. And there's also the Tennessee Valley Authority itself. If the federal government was able to electrify America under FDR without computers or any of the modern technologies we have available to us today, think of what we can do now. And he mentions also that the municipal and cooperative electric utilities still provide some of the least expensive electricity in the country today. And he says, as part of the Green New Deal, we're going to expand on that success. The second bullet point is to build enough renewable energy generation capacity for the growing needs of our nation. Here he says, currently 4 federal power marketing administrations, the PMAs, and the Tennessee Valley Authority generate and transmit power to distribution utilities in 33 states. So now there are 4 PMAs and the TVA. He proposes to create one more PMA to cover the remaining states and territories and expand the PMAs that exist now to build more than enough wind, solar energy storage, and geothermal power plants. And he proposes to spend $1.52 trillion on renewable energy and $850 billion to build energy storage capacity. And the plan says together with an EPA federal renewable energy standard, this will fully drive out non-sustainable energy sources. Okay, the next bullet point says we will end greed in our energy system. How is he going to do that? He says the renewable energy generated by the Green New Deal will be publicly owned, managed by the Federal Power Marketing Administrations, the Bureau of the Bureau of the Bureau of Reclamation and the Tennessee Valley Authority, and sold to distribution utilities with a preference for public powered districts and municipally and cooperatively owned utilities with democratic public ownership, and other existing utilities, evidently private companies, that demonstrate a commitment to the public interest. The plan says the Department of Energy will provide technical assistance to states and municipalities that would like to establish publicly owned distribution utilities or community choice aggregation programs in their communities. And they're going to sell electricity at the current rates to keep the cost of electricity stable during this transition. Next, he wants to build a modern smart grid. A smart grid means a resilient, secure, and intelligent electric grid system that is capable of managing high amounts of renewable energy, but charging electric vehicles quickly and maximizing efficiency. And he says we will spend $526 billion on a modern, high-volt, underground, renewable, direct current, smart electric transmission and distribution grid. Will ensure our transition to 100% sustainable energy is safe and smooth. The next bullet point is to weatherize homes and businesses to perform energy efficiency upgrades to make buildings more energy efficient and lower energy bills. Here he says we will provide $2.18 trillion for sliding scale grants for low and for moderate income families and small businesses to invest in the weatherizing and retrofitting of their homes and businesses. And he says that that weatherization will reduce the residential energy consumption by 30%. He then mentions our mobile home stock, which he says is leaking now and often very old. And he wants to replace, that is, he's going to prioritize replacing the oldest, the leakiest, and the least energy efficient homes, and the homes of seniors and people with disabilities and low income families first. And he proposes a federal mandate through the Department of Energy that will ensure that new and existing commercial buildings and wealthy homeowners meet our energy retrofit goals. Next, he wants to electrify our homes and our businesses. One of the best ways to ensure that everyone is comfortable in their homes on the hottest days of summer, the coldest days of winter, is to bring all non-electric uses of energy onto the electric grid. For example, so many of our homes still use dirty oil and propane and fracked natural gas for heating and cooling. And he says we plan to provide 964 billion for sliding scale grants for low and moderate income families and small businesses to invest in cheaper electricity for these needs. And he says a federal mandate but through the Department of Energy will ensure that all new construction, existing big business, commercial buildings, and wealthy homeowners meet um, our our electrification goals. He wants to phase out the use of non-sustainable sources. He says the plan will stop the building of new nuclear power plants and find a real solution to our existing waste problems. That is, uh, the waste problems we have with nuclear waste. It will also enact a moratorium on nuclear power plant license renewals in the United States to protect surrounding communities. He says we know that the byproducts, okay, of nuclear plants, the toxic waste, okay, they produce, are not worth the risks of the technology's benefit, especially in light of lessons that are learned about from the Fukushima meltdown and the Chernobyl disaster. To get to our goal of 100% sustainable energy, we will not rely on any false solutions like the geoengineering, okay, nuclear carbon capture, okay, and sequestration, or trash incinerators. And here he's talking about large scale types, okay, of engineering solutions. He's for carbon sequestration in the soil through regenerative forms, okay, of agriculture, as he makes clear later. He wants to regulate all dangerous greenhouse gases. And he says that CO2 is a very dangerous greenhouse gas, but it's not the only one we have to address. The second one, okay, is methane, and he points out that's 86 times more powerful than CO2 at trapping heat in the atmosphere. And then he mentions the hydrofluorocarbons, which can be more than 1,000 times more powerful. And he says the EPA will, under the Clean Air Act, they'll regulate CO2 and methane and the HFCs. And he says by aggressively enforcing our laws will end the injustice of 100,000 Americans dying each year from air pollution. I have to confess, I didn't know that the fatalities were 100,000 per year dying, okay, from air pollution. Shame on me. And he wants to declare a climate emergency. So do I. He says there is a climate emergency which demands a massive scale mobilization to halt, to reverse and address its consequences and causes. The plan says Bernie will declare a national emergency on climate change and will take immediate, large scale action to reverse its effects. He says this is an existential threat, and we will do whatever it takes to confront it. Now he gets into the transportation segment of this, and he makes an introductory statement. He points out that transportation currently accounts for 29% of the domestic emissions, okay, of greenhouse gases. And he says we're going to create alternatives to power our cars and trucks and move our transportation sector beyond fossil fuels by running our cars and trucks on renewable sources. And he talks about high-speed passenger and cargo rail and an efficient public transportation system. And he says we will create actually millions of good paying, and union jobs building the automobile fleet of the future. He says we will invest in nationwide electric vehicle charging infrastructure to increase access to these resources for all, just as we built an interstate highway system in the 1950s and 60s. He said we will move further than oil towards an electric car. His concerns of cost and whether there will be access to a charging station have stopped people from being able to choose this low carbon option. He says we're going to change that. When Bernie is president, he's going to fully transform our energy sector away from fossil fuels, ensuring no one is priced out of this transition. And then there are bullet points. He says, as president, Bernie will fully electrify and decarbonize our transportation sector. And the plan offers a federal grant and zero emission vehicle program to create 100% renewable transportation sector. He says zero emission vehicle programs are already having success. Having success actually all across the country. In order to transition to 100% electric vehicles powered with renewable energy instead of expensive fossil fuels, we will institute grants to purchase a new electric vehicle. He's going to provide $2.1 trillion in grants to low and moderate income families and small businesses to trade in their fossil fuel vehicles for new electric vehicles. He points out that currently purchasers of the EVs are wealthier than buyers of conventional cars, but that as president, he'll make sure working families share the benefits of this transition and nobody is left behind. Proposes a vehicle trade-in program. He wants to fund it with $681 billion for low and for moderate income families and small businesses for a trade-in program to get the old cars off the road. He says families with a conventional car will be able to access an additional incentive for trading in but for an American-made EV. So he's going to require that the new electric vehicles are going to be American-made. That is to say, manufactured in the U.S. He points to the successful trade-in program in the Obama administration that helped accelerate the transition to greater efficiency cars, and he wants to expand on the program and make it stronger by requiring even higher efficiency, and making it available only to cars manufactured in the United States. So he wants to make sure then that we reindustrialize in the vehicle sector, and that union jobs are created again in this particular sector. One can look at this as basically proposing to revitalize the auto industries in the states of Wisconsin, in Michigan, Ohio, parts of Indiana, but Pennsylvania, where there was some activity in this area. Okay, in other words, he's saying there's going to be $681 billion, $68.1 billion per year over 10 years to do this, okay, to make this transition, and that's going to be pumped into the domestic auto industry. Okay, next, of course, he addresses the problem of the charging infrastructure for the electric vehicles. And here he says we'll spend 85.6 billion to build a national electric vehicle charging infrastructure network similar to the gas stations and rest stops we have today. He says we'll ensure that our new EV stations are on open access and interoperable between all payment systems. He says under our plan, drivers will no longer need to worry about where to charge their car or if they can pay for it. Because as long as you're part of a payment system, you'll be able to pay for it. He gets to the topic then of school and transit buses. He wants to provide 407 billion in grants for states to help the school districts and transit agencies replace all school and transit buses with electric buses. And then he says some things about the EPA and their classification, okay, of diesel exhaust as a probable human carcinogen. He points out the exhaust contains over 40 different chemicals, okay, and air pollutants that are classified as hazardous under the Clean Air Act. He points out children in school buses are exposed to concentration of these substances that can be 5 to 15 times higher than the background levels that negatively impact their health and performance in school. And he says once older buses are replaced with clean electric buses, school districts will save in fuel and maintenance costs over the life cycle of the bus. And 407 billion, okay, in grants. It's 40.7 billion each year to states in order to facilitate this particular transition. It looks like the funding that he proposes is enough to do that. He wants to replace all shipping trucks, and they've calculated that means they must spend 216 billion to replace all diesel tractor trailer trucks with fast charging and long range electric trucks. Truck drivers from the largest fleets to small owner operators will be able to access this funding, the $216 billion, which I presume will be for grants or for loans. Next, he wants to ensure the decarbonization of the transportation sector. He says the EPA and the Department of Transportation will assist in the decarbonization of personal and commercial vehicles through regulation enforcement, okay, and technical assistance. And he points out that President Trump weakened clean car mandates on the manufacturing, okay, of autos, which some of the manufacturers opposed. And he says, our administration will work with schools, transit agencies, cities, states, and private companies to establish standards for the auto manufacturing to be 100% sustainable by 2030. And he wants to build public transit that is affordable, accessible, and resilient. And he says with a $300 billion investment, we will increase public transit ridership by 65% by 2030. Next, he wants to build regional high-speed rail. He points out that many other developed nations have advanced high-speed rail systems. He proposes a $607 billion investment in a regional high-speed rail system to complete the vision of the Obama administration in order to develop high-speed intercity rail in the United States. He wants to have this as a meaningful alternative to plane or car travel that's affordable for people between major cities. And he points out the reason high speed rail has not worked in the United States is because we have not built the political mobilization which was needed to demand the funding that's needed to complete this vision. And he says, together we'll create the movement needed in order to develop high speed rail. Okay, I want to comment here that this whole plan, all these details, okay, that he's advancing here, are based on his plans to create a political movement to back all this up. And I want to point out that in this respect, he's very different from the other candidates. What all the other candidates seem to be doing is saying, look, we're going to take the political system as it is now. We're not going to try to change the underlying political system. Even the structural changes that are proposed by Warren, even those structural changes do not propose to mobilize people into a movement that's going to back the changes that the administration of that candidate is actually proposing. In other words, all the other candidates are proposing to keep the system as is, with the exception, okay, of doing something about the funding. In other words, they will try to get money out of politics, okay, in many cases. But they're not going to do anything to build a mass movement in order to get money out of politics. They're not focused on building, on trying to build a mass movement that will continuously back the administration, okay, in its efforts to bring change to the United States. We have to understand that's really where Bernie differs so much from the other candidates. That last sentence, together we will create the movement needed to develop high-speed rail. What he's saying there is that the movement that's in back of all these things will also be a movement backing high-speed rail. And remember, he's already got more than 1 million volunteers in this particular movement. And he hasn't gotten into the thick of the primaries yet. And he hasn't become the nominee yet. And he hasn't become the president yet. We have to ask ourselves, if this goes on, and if he runs on this, and if he runs on the criminal justice reform that he just released earlier this week, and if, I'm sorry, that was last week, and if he runs on the workplace democracy reform that he proposed a few days back, and he runs on Medicare for all, and he runs on what he has here, if he does become the president, what kind of movement will be in back of him at that time? And you have to ask yourself, will it be enough to back all of the things that he's proposing here, including building the high-speed rail system, okay, that he wants to build? It seems to me, okay, it is going to be enough. But when discussing whether his views here are practical or not, you have to keep in mind that he's not proposing these things in a vacuum or merely as someone who expects to be elected as the President of the United States. He's proposing these things as the leader of a movement that is millions strong and that is continually pressuring the federal government for these reforms. Next, he wants to retrofit dangerous fossil fuel infrastructure. He points out in 2013, 800,000 gallons of crude oil was spilled in railroad accidents. In 2014, an average of one oil train derailed every 5 days. The Federal Railroad Administration will adopt new rules requiring companies to retrofit the coal and oil bomb trains to prevent explosions, derailments, and spills. And he says we'll take similar action to protect the community's well pads, substations, compressor stations, and pipelines as we remove fossil fuels to better protect communities that never asked to be cited in their footprint. So clearly, among the communities that he wants to protect here are the Native American communities that are being exposed constantly to the fossil fuel companies and their activities. But also, he wants to protect the suburban communities that are now finding themselves in danger from fracking projects that are being developed in those areas. He also proposes an R&D program, which is the next section here. He says, despite massive federal subsidies for fossil fuels, renewable energies have improved in cost efficiency year after year and now rival or surpass conventional energies in cost effectiveness. He says, what we lack is long-term federal commitment to our scientists and engineers in the sustainable energy sector to accelerate innovation in both energy production and storage. He says, our country developed the internet, light bulbs, and the GPS. And we developed a cure for polio. And the plan says a Bernie Sanders administration will spur the development of the technologies and the innovations we need to tackle the climate crisis. And then this section on R&D goes on with the bullet points. He talks about the sunshot that was carried out by the Obama administration. It points out it successfully decreased the cost of installed solar by 90%. It says there are similar energy storage programs, at DOE and some of our national labs that aim to decrease the cost of solutions like the solar batteries. It says we will similarly decrease the cost of energy storage and meet the daily and long-term reliability needs. We will invest $30 billion for a storage shot initiative to meet those goals. The storage shot program will have a goal of commercializing technologies that can provide energy lasting 24 hours to multiple days at a capital cost lower than $1,000 a kilowatt to support the renewable energy needed to phase out coal and natural gas plants that currently serve as base generation on the grid. The program will also aim to decrease the cost of daily cycling storage resources by at least a factor of 3 in order to reliably and affordably replace all coal and natural gas plants that serve as backup on the grid. And he says, additionally, in order to ensure an affordable and complete transition away from fossil fuels in the transportation sector, we will spend $100 billion to uh, decrease the cost of a new electric vehicle to at most $18,000. Second bullet point here. He wants to invest in decarbonizing the shipping and aviation industries as soon as possible. Since the science is clear that the entire global economy must be decarbonized by 2050 at the latest if we hope to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. As you know, I believe it's going to have to be before that. We'll probably have to decarbonize everything by 2035. It's going to be a mad race for survival in relation to that. He says we must be extremely careful to ensure that as we do this, we make sure that domestic manufacturing and clean economy industries thrive. The federal government must identify and commercialize technologies to ensure the globe is able to fully decarbonize by 2050 at the latest to meet the goals in the IPCC report. Since the report was actually released last October, I believe, or about 2018. Okay, there's much evidence that has appeared suggesting the report was too conservative in its targets. If what we have in mind is the goal of staying at 1.5 Celsius, or getting to 1.5 degrees. Anyway, and since he's determined to get to 1.5 degrees, I think that suggests we're going to have to decarbonize a lot sooner by 2050. But here he proposes to fund a $500 billion effort to research technologies to fully decarbonize industry and a $150 billion effort to fully decarbonize aviation and also maritime shipping and transportation industries. So that's a lot of money. Altogether, he's talking about $650 billion here, or an average of $65 billion per year over the next 10 years. Actually, the next 10 years, he won't get to pass this the earliest until 2021. So then he's talking about the 9 years, well, actually the 10 years between 2021 and 2030. And that's going to really have to be front loaded, because the way things are looking in terms of the evidence, of global warming and its effects, we may be reaching certain tipping points within 3 to 5 years. Anyway, he wants to establish a nationwide materials recycling program. And here the plan harkens back to what we did in the fight to win World War II. And he says we must do the same thing to win the fight against climate change. He says we must build the wind turbines, solar panels, new cars, and batteries we need with as many recycled materials as possible. He wants to establish a take back program to require large corporations that produce goods with the materials needed for this clean energy transition to pay to take those goods back from consumers who no longer want them, to establish a nationwide materials recycling program so we can use as many uh, as many recycled materials as possible to build the renewable energy equipment needed to transform our energy system. He says we'll also invest in research for less resource intensive methods and alternatives to plastic from fossil fuels, rapidly moving away from the petrochemical plastics production. And then the final bullet point in this section is to reassert our leadership in research and engineering by marshaling resources across the federal government, institutions of higher education, including the National Academy of Engineering and the National Science Foundation. And he says we have an obligation and an economic opportunity to be a leader in developing and deploying the clean technological solutions that will solve climate change. It says R&D in the challenges of the cost of storage, and electric vehicles, and of decarbonizing industry, aviation, and shipping could put the U.S. back in a position of leadership around the world. The next section, appropriately enough, is on using the power of international uh, international leadership. He talks about the Paris Climate Agreement, which was signed by 175 parties. He says the agreement was not perfect. He said even if every nation met the agreement, it would still allow for 3 degrees Celsius, of warming, which he said, which would destroy island nations and the people least responsible for the climate crisis. He points to the IPCC report and he says it issued a dire warning to the world. We have no time left to come together as a global force and aggressively reduce our carbon pollution emissions. It also made a strong case for limiting warming at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius if we hope to continue to have a habitable planet. And it says, as president, he's going to provide strong, inclusive American leadership to not only transform our own energy system, but to reach out to countries all over the world and cooperate on the global crisis of climate change. He says we have to recognize that people from every country in the world, Russia, India, China, Japan, Brazil, that we're all in this together. Instead of accepting the world's countries will spend 1.5 trillion annually on weapons of destruction, Bernie will convene global leaders to redirect our priorities to confront our shared enemy, which is climate change. And he says, together we will lead the international community to keep global warming at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We will not only reduce our carbon emissions by 71%, we will support less industrialized nations in the global south, excluding China, to help them to reduce emissions by 36% from 2017 levels by 2030, consistent with meeting our fair share of emissions reductions under the UN's IPCC recommendations. Okay, so of course he's going to rejoin the IPCC. Then he goes into detail in the bullet points, a series of bullet points. and states our intentions to promote peace and aggressively reduce our emissions in an effort to get the international community to agree to limit emissions to keep the world at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius, okay, of warming. He wants to invest in a green climate fund to support efforts in the global south, climate adaptation efforts and assistance, okay, in adopting sustainable energies. And he proposes the $200 billion Green Climate Fund for the purpose of an equitable transfer of renewable technologies. Okay. And he says that our leadership can ensure, okay, that the developing world secures reliable electricity, reduces poverty and pollution-related fatalities, creates greater net employment, and improves their living standards, all while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. He wants to bring together the leaders of the major industrialized nations with the goal of using the trillions of dollars our nation spends on wars and weapons of mass destruction to instead work together internationally to combat our climate crisis and take on the fossil fuel industry. The plan says Bernie recognizes the Pentagon as the largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases in the world and that the United States spends $81 billion annually to protect oil supplies and transport routes. He says we are uniquely positioned to lead the planet in a wholesale shift away from militarism. And he says it because very much of the militarism in the world is due to ourselves. So we are in a great position to lead in moving away from militarism. So, okay, the next bullet point is to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and enforce aggressive climate reduction goals. He also says we must think beyond Paris. He says the U.S. must lead the way in achieving binding and enforceable goals on a multilateral basis to avoid the most catastrophic results of climate change. He says we must ensure genuine international cooperation in line with the IPCC's findings. And he wants to renegotiate the disastrous trade deals we have made to protect the environment. And he points out that NAFTA and also the deal to normalize our trade relations with China outsourced actually millions of American jobs, but have also allowed our corporations to outsource their pollution to other nations. Trade deals have been written in secret by billion-dollar companies to give the polluters special handouts and special protections, as well as the right to sue governments that pursue stronger environmental policies. Under Sanders' administration, he says, this will end. Trade deals will be renegotiated to ensure strong and binding climate standards, labor rights, and human rights with swift enforcement. Well, I'd really like to see how he does that. I completely agree that it is absolutely necessary, and I look forward to his efforts in this respect, the trade deals have been terrible for us as a nation. They've been terrible for our people. He says the trade deals. Ah, I said that already. Okay. Next bullet point. He wants to end overseas fossil fuel financing. Points out the federal government currently supports investments in fossil fuels throughout, but through the World Bank, the IMF, the OPIC, the Export Import Bank, and other multilateral institutions. He says these international investments are inconsistent with a goal to curb the climate crisis, and they must end. He says the Sanders administration will lead these international financial institutions in advancing the equitable adoption of sustainable energy across the planet. Now, those bullet points are very, very important. Then he says he wants to invest in resilience and justice. And his bullet points, okay, under that are he wants to create a climate justice resiliency fund as president. And he says the CJRF will ensure our infrastructure and communities are protected from the unavoidable impacts of climate change. He said once the CJRF is established and funded at $40 billion, EPA, together with a number of other agencies, will conduct a nationwide survey to identify areas with high climate impact, vulnerabilities, and other socioeconomic factors, public health challenges, and environmental hazards. He says each community will then be eligible for funding in order of the most vulnerable to the least vulnerable. And he's going to have an interagency council which will issue block grants to states, territories, tribes, cities, counties, localities, and nonprofit community organizations. It says the funds will be able to be used for climate resiliency projects, for building emergency community centers and shelters with reliable backup power, wetland restoration, abandoned fossil fuel infrastructure, and other environmental hazard reclamation, seawalls, community relocation, community evacuation plans, and resources for safe and complete evacuation. All that sounds great, except I really wonder whether the $40 billion over 10 years, okay, is going to be enough. It sounds like we're talking more like $40 billion per year, maybe $400 billion over 10 years. That might be enough. Anyway, he says within the CJRF, we will establish an Office of Climate Resiliency for people with disabilities. The office will be led by people with disabilities to ensure that nationwide the needs of people with disabilities are consistently addressed during adaptation planning, that those efforts are coordinated throughout the federal government. Next, he wants to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. In order to remain resilient to the climate impacts we know are coming, we must repair our crumbling infrastructure. And he says our outdated and dangerous national infrastructure is not ready to withstand impacts like floods, hurricanes, and wildfires. And Bernie has already introduced the legislation into the Senate to rebuild America's aging drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. He wants to repair the water systems of the nation. He points out that Flint, Michigan still does not have clean water. And he points out that communities all over the country, from Denmark, South Carolina, to the rural part of Iowa, are faced with similar dangerous contamination such as lead, um, 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 also diseases or other toxic pollution like by PFAS. And the plan says Bernie introduced the Water Act, which would provide up to $34.85 billion for, and then there's a list, okay, of bullet points that lists revolving fund programs, okay, and grant programs that he wants to support that are aimed, okay, at water systems and at technical assistance to rural, small, and tribal systems for drinking water systems and for wastewater systems. And there are a host okay, of other purposes too, all within the overall category of improving water okay, and wastewater systems and basically rebuilding them. He also wants to build resilient, affordable, and publicly owned the broadband infrastructure, and he wants to provide 150 billion in infrastructure grants and technical assistance for cities and states to build publicly owned and democratic controlled cooperative or open access broadband networks. And he says this communication infrastructure will ensure first responders and communities are ready to deal with the worst climate emergencies. Okay, he wants uh, the states and the municipalities to build these these networks and to own also these networks. So he's talking public ownership here as an alternative to the private ownership okay, that we have now. That point is very, very important, and it's a big change. And it's going to be fought against very, very hard by Verizon and by Comcast, okay, and by other companies that have been building the infrastructure and offering services from the infrastructure to us. There's going to be big political fights over that. He wants to increase funding for roads. Points out that our national roads and highway system is crumbling, and he points out that that Bernie's Rebuild America Act provides $75 billion for the National Highway Trust Fund to improve our roads, bridges, and other transportation infrastructure in the United States, and another $2 billion for other surface transportation needs. Next, he talks about our freight and passenger transportation networks, and he points out also that his act actually provides $5 billion for Tiger Grant projects that build or repair critical pieces of our freight and passenger transportation networks that are located in our rural areas. Those figures, those last figures, 75 billion for the National Highway Trust Fund, and the extra 2 billion and the extra 5 billion, they don't sound like enough to me. It seems to me that the problems are far larger than that. He also recently proposed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And that wasn't solely focused on National Highway Trust Fund an application to roads, and bridges, and other transformation infrastructure. But it seems like our roads are in much worse condition than would be solved by 75 billion, in funding. This might be. I think in terms of total infrastructure needs, we're probably talking $4.2 trillion. Now, he's got a lot of the infrastructure work that's spread out, in the Green New Deal plan here that would also be in any $4.2 trillion plan. But I just don't know if he's allocated enough to a highway trust fund here or to fixing surface transportation needs. But, of course, even this extremely detailed statement of the plan is not sufficiently detailed, to evaluate that. But I'm sure organizations that are working in this area are going to be pitching in with their ideas as to whether this money, is enough. He wants to build 7.4 million affordable housing units to close the affordable housing gap across the country and guarantee safe, decent, and accessible affordable housing. And he says he wants to greatly expand the National Housing Trust Fund to build the units that are necessary to guarantee housing as a right to all Americans. Doesn't have a dollar figure there. Seems to me that's going to be very expensive. It's something we need to do. It's something we must do. And it's very important, for energy efficiency, and for retrofitting as well. But, I'd like to see a dollar figure for that. And to retrofit our public infrastructure to withstand climate impacts, he says, beyond repairing our existing crumbling infrastructure, we must ensure our public highways, our bridges, and water systems are ready for climate impacts we know are coming. We'll invest $636.1 billion in our roads, bridges, and water infrastructure to ensure it is resilient to climate impacts, and another $300 billion to ensure that all new infrastructure built over the next 10 years is also resilient to the climate impacts. So that is much more serious funding. So there's probably overlap between what he's talking about here and what he talked about in some of the earlier bullet points. That we're not in a position to judge the overlap from this plan. He wants to adapt to sea level rise. He points out that 40% of the United States, over 126 million Americans, live on the coast. Because such a high percentage of the American people live on the coast, coastal resiliency deserves special attention. We will provide coastal communities with $162 billion in funding to adapt to sea level rise. Now that's very serious funding, but whether it's enough to accommodate what's likely to happen in the next few years to the coastal areas, especially if the Greenland melt, should continue, and especially if 2 or 3 years from now, as some people are beginning to predict, we see a disappearance of the Arctic ice. I am not sure whether that amount is going to be enough to help coastal communities, to adapt to sea level rise. We're already seeing a rise that, in many communities is really fairly near catastrophe now. He wants to increase funding for firefighting to deal with more frequent and severe wildfires. He wants to increase funding for firefighting by $18 billion for federal firefighters to deal with the increased severity and frequency, of wildfires. I think that's very good. It would be very good to have federal firefighters going in there and helping the local firefighters in California and Oregon, Washington, and other places where fires are starting to hit. But again, I that 18 billion figure looks low to me. Now, I consider these figures from Bernie to be tentative, and I have to say that the $16.2 trillion that he's proposing for this whole plan seems low to me. To me, it seems like it's going to be more like I'd feel more comfortable with double that amount, okay, being allocated to that. But that's something that will happen as we move along and as we see that it is going to cost more. I'm not worried about how we're going to pay for it because, as most of you know, I know how to pay for it, and I'm not bothered by the problems of how to pay for it. That's one of my areas of specialization. So, he wants to protect community cohesion. After Hurricane Katrina, 24% of New Orleans residents, uh, including low income families and people of color, evacuated the city, were never able to return. Same thing is still happening in Puerto Rico today, as almost 130,000 people have been forced to leave the island because the federal government has failed to distribute all the disaster aid that was approved by Congress. He says he's going to amend the Stafford Act to ensure that FEMA is empowered to address this problem specifically, to ensure that recovery and rebuilding efforts make affected communities stronger than they were before the disaster, so that they are more resilient to the next one, which, of course, Bernie knows is coming down the pike. He knows that these disasters are going to be normal until we get the climate emergency under control. He wants to increase investments in the hazard mitigation grant program, which already exists in FEMA. And he points out the program saves $4 for every $1 invested up front by decreasing the impact of future disasters. And he wants to invest $2 billion more to ensure communities that are rebuilt after disaster strike have necessary resources to build back stronger than before the disaster. Next, he wants to conserve our public lands, and of course, he says the usual things about how they're a treasure and stuff. Then he gets to bullet points. And he says, as president, Bernie will invest in green infrastructure and public lands conservation by reinstating the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, one of the most successful of the New Deal programs and most rapid uh, peacetime type cave mobilization in American history. It says the CCC put millions of men to work building and maintaining trails and conserving America's wilderness. By the time the program ended at the start of World War II, it had planted more than 3.5 billion trees, and even today stands responsible for more than half the reforestation done in our nation's history. That's a staggering statistic there. We will invest 171 billion in reauthorizing and expanding the CCC to provide good-paying jobs, building green infrastructure, planting billions of trees, and other native species. Okay, and that's in order to prevent a flood and soil erosion, to rebuild the wetlands and coral, but clean up the plastic pollution, to construct and maintain accessible paths, trails, and fire breaks, to rehabilitate and remove the abandoned structures, and eradicating invasive species and flora disease and other natural methods of carbon pollution sequestration. It says we must take these natural solutions seriously as an important part of our strategy to solve the climate um, crisis. Then he wants to fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund. He says for 50 years, the LWCF has helped stimulate our nation's 1.7 trillion a year outdoor um, 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 outdoor um, 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 1.7 trillion a year outdoor recreation, natural resource protection, and historical preservation industry by conserving millions of acres in our national parks, uh, okay, in our wildlife refuges, forests, and wild and scenic river corridors via over 41,000 state and local projects. In 2019, the LWCF was permanently authorized. However, it has been chronically underfunded. In other words, the authorization bills were there, the appropriations bills were not. He says we will spend 900 million to permanently fund the LWCF to safeguard natural areas, water resources, and our cultural heritage, and to provide opportunities for recreation, okay, to all Americans. That again seems a little underfunded to me. Uh, and finally, final bullet points and final item in this section. He wants to end the maintenance backlog in our national parks and bring them up to date. Says our national parks and park rangers help educate the public about the need to protect wild spices, sequester carbon by protecting the wilderness, and conserve historical, cultural, and natural resources. Our national parks have fallen into serious and dangerous disrepair. Will perform more than $25 billion of repairs and maintenance on roads, buildings, utility systems, and other structures and facilities across the national park system. Now that sounds like it might be enough. This will help ensure that park visitors have a safe and enjoyable experience connecting with nature for years to come. So that's item one of his plan. In other words, all that is the detail under the title Transform Our Energy System to 100% renewable energy and create 20 million jobs. I think you can see from the list of extensive activities that it can well create the 20 million jobs, okay, we're talking about, and that it can create, it can transform our energy system until it's entirely based on renewable sources. So, no one else has come close to proposing a plan which is anywhere this comprehensive. I think everybody has to conclude in reading this that Bernie is very serious about this and very much committed to implementing this plan and solving our problems in this particular area. Well, I spent a very long time on this now, actually longer, okay, than I intended. I will consider a few questions and comments. I do want to point out that there still remains items 2, 3, and 4 in his plan to go. We may be able to handle that tomorrow. Item 1 was by far the most extensive of the items, but items 2, 3, and 4, or sections 2, 3, and 4, are also extremely important from a human point of view and from the point of view of the transition and whether it will be a just and fair transition, okay, or not. And tomorrow we'll begin to see how complete his ideas are and how comprehensive his ideas are, okay, about what that transition, okay, is likely to be like. And that transition will begin let me see that I'm clear on the organization of this. His section 2 is about ending the greed of the fossil fuel industry and holding them accountable. Section 3 is about rebuilding our economy and ensuring justice for frontline communities and a just transition, okay, for workers. And Section 4 that's a very long section. Okay, and that's what Section 3 is about. It includes a lot of other topics. Okay, so I'll try to get through those 2 sections tomorrow, but I'll try to keep the time I spend on both of those sections down to 45 minutes tomorrow. If it looks like I'm not going to be able to do that, I'll stop at the end of 45 minutes, okay, to give you a chance to comment. And then on Monday, I'll complete my going through the details of Bernie's plan. But what I've been trying to give you by going through this is a sense of how comprehensive and society transforming this Green New Deal plan is going to be. And that impression is going to be reinforced when we get into sections 2 and 3. These plans that Bernie has been laying out will truly transform us into a different and a better society if we can succeed, okay, in implementing them. So, okay, I'm going to leave this screen now and go back to my main screen. And now I'll check what you've had to say and give you a chance to weigh in. Okay, Russ pointed out the sound was decent, but had a little bit of an echo. Sorry about that, Russ. And Randy Hedgebeth was there. And Nancy Blackmore was there. Hi, Nancy. Dale Weaver was here. Okay, and Also, Rob Rivera says, "Hey Yoda, hey Rob," and Rob asks me how I'm doing. I'm doing fine, Rob. How you doing? Rob says he just got back from a Bernie town hall. It was great. I gotta say, seeing Bernie in person is so different than as opposed to seeing some videos of him. Well, how's he look in person? But does he look as vigorous in person as he looks on video? And also, Rebecca McClaskey joined, and my brother Hal Firestone joined. Johnny Axum joined again. He must have gone fourth, and then he rejoined. And Randy Hedgebeth is here. Hiya, Randy. Says, I think all those locomotives, cars, and other equipment they abandoned in remote areas. Also, the thousands of acres of aluminum aircraft in the deserts, the Southwest deserts. That's a lot that can be recycled, isn't it, Randy? And Russ says he's got to call it a night. Okay, Russ, good night. If you're still here, good night. And if you're not still here, then good night anyway. Because hopefully you'll be checking in later. Randy says it does not matter how much this costs, as it is total job creation and infrastructure investment which does not go away or squandered. I agree. I happen to have a housing system for this agenda. I know you do, Randolph. We discussed it not too long ago. We can discuss it again when you'd like to. During the mid-50s, this country's largest cities demolished and reconstructed housing on a very large scale, which no one else talks about. That's true, but I'm aware that that happened. Margot Shepard has joined. Hi, Margot. Okay, and Nancy Blackmore says, thanks for this evening. I'm looking for more. Well, but thank you, Nancy. There'll be more tomorrow when we take up the details of Section 2 of his plan. And Rob says, Bernie looks great. He has this presence. He's got this aura. He's got the fire, right? He's still got the fire in his belly. 78 and all, right? He's not tired. I think he has more fire in his belly now than he had in 2016. I think he's like someone who's gotten close to his goal and knows that he has only a little ways to go. And that in sensing that, he is he's just getting more and more excited as the campaign goes on. He seems to draw strength from the crowds in place after place. And Rob says, yeah, he does. I can't describe it. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. It can be tough to describe that kind of thing. He seems to take oxygen from the people. He takes oxygen from the people. I don't know too many politicians who have done that in exactly that way. In his own way, I suppose Trump does that too, in relation to his people, okay, at his events. He seems to love the events. He seems to love it. Rob says, when I see Bernie, I see a lion getting older and watching their mane grow big and fluffy. Well, as long as he's not the lion in winter. At this point, we don't need a winter lion. We need a lion who's all there until he sets us on the road, okay, at least. What happens after that can be carried on by other people who learn from him. But right now, I think we need him, and that we need him very badly. So, any other comments or questions or statements? Uh, okay, well, I've read the whole thing. I haven't talked about the whole thing yet. Okay, I've talked about the overview, and now I've talked about section one here tonight. But my impression from reading the whole thing is that this is a wonderful plan. Like all plans, it can be improved. Okay. Oh, so you asked me, is there anything you disagree with? Is there anything that needs to be stronger? I think the area of carbon sequestration into the soil using natural methods, okay, of sequestration. In other words, okay, I think the area using regenerative forms, okay, of agriculture could stand, okay, to be strengthened, and perhaps more explicit funding would be needed to accelerate that. I also think some of the figures that he quotes seem to me to be too small. And as I went through section one, I said where I thought the funding he specified so far was too small. But I'm not entirely in a position to judge that. It was just an intuitive sense. Okay, I would need to see more details of the thoughts behind the plan because, as lengthy as this is, it doesn't give the justifications for the levels of funding suggested. I know that considerable thought must be behind them because the detail of the plan actually suggests that. But we would have to see more to see whether the details, are actually justified. But if you take a look at the video again, you'll see where I remarked on the funding being adequate or the funding being too little or where the plan has to be stronger. Yeah, I just got Bill Mitchell's and Randy Ray's textbook on macroeconomics today. Yeah, that's the MMT textbook. It's going to be the MMT Bible for sure. It's going to be the reference book that everybody turns to. So I'm sure you're real excited about that, Rob. I think it's going to have all kinds of new stuff in it that we haven't seen before, not even on Bill's blog. Any other comments or questions? While you think about that, I'm going to ask you all to share. I'm going to ask you all to please share, like, and subscribe. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe underscore Firestone, all in lowercase letters. Okay. And now I'll go check out if you have any more comments. Rob says, I think Warren has an extremely comprehensive Green New Deal plan. I don't think it's anywhere near as comprehensive as this. In other words, we haven't gotten into sections 2, 3, and 4 yet. And I'm fairly certain that her plan is not as comprehensive as what I've just been through in section 1. And I'm almost certain that her plans for the other 3 sections that we're going to go through tomorrow and perhaps on Monday, okay, that those are also more extensive than her comparable remarks on the issues raised in those particular sections. I mean, I think there's no way that she's as upfront, okay, as Bernie in her plan. And I'm not saying she doesn't have some good ideas there. I'm sure she does, but I don't think the comprehensiveness is anywhere near Bernie. And Rob says, I know Warren is nowhere near comprehensive. He says, I'm being sarcastic. Oh, sorry. Sometimes I don't pick up on sarcasm. I guess the reason for that is I rarely use sarcasm. One point in my life, I took very seriously Shakespeare's aphorism that sarcasm is the cheapest form of wit. Sorry, Rob. Rob says, because 2 trillion is going to be more than enough to transform energy and the economy. Well, that, of course, is more sarcasm. What Bernie was suggesting was 16.2 trillion in this plan. And of course, I'm saying that I think it's likely to be 32 trillion over 10 years or 3.2 trillion per year. And don't say we can't afford it. We can afford it. We can afford it. We have, right now, in this first year, we have $2.5 trillion worth of policy space. That's deficit spending space. $2.5 trillion by itself. That's just for this year. The point is, as the economy expands, we have more and more policy space that becomes available each year. But in addition to that, what Bernie, okay, is going to do, what Bernie, okay, is going to do is he's probably going to cut our defense spending in half, which is going to give us, okay, a lot more. And then his programs are going to replace a lot of the social safety net spending that we have to have now. Won't replace the social safety net. That will still stay there. And we're going to add the job guarantee also. But the spending on the social safety net is going to decrease because we're going to have true full employment for the most part just based on the programs. We'll probably end up with not more than 2 or 3 million people in the job guarantee program. And Rob says, I just don't see 16 trillion being enough. Yeah, I don't either. My own estimate was it's probably going to be twice that. It's probably going to be 33 trillion. Okay. And Michael Hexter, when he did his estimates back in 2014, he was suggesting it might cost from 4 to 6 trillion per year to actually do, a Green New Deal that would work. Now, some of that spending overlaps with the Medicare for All program, okay, that Bernie has, and with some of the programs that he proposed here. But the idea that this might take 3.3 trillion a year over 10 years is not out of line. Now, we have to remember that if we have like 2.5 trillion in the first year, and by then, of course, our GDP will be bigger. It'll be 2021, so we'll have more like 3 trillion, which is going to be available in the first year. Then that 3 trillion is going to add to GDP probably another 5 trillion. So at that point, we're going to have a GDP that might be, I don't know, 27 trillion, okay, or 28 trillion. So in the second year, we're looking at having 3.5 trillion in policy space and increasing each year. So over 10 years, the deficit spending that we have room for could equal the cost of the Green New Deal. Now, of course, we're going to have to tax more too as we go up, uh, because we do have to create more policy space. But that's in Bernie's plan, okay, already. He plans to tax the rich, okay, a lot more. He plans to tax the corporations, okay, a lot more. He plans to tax the fossil fuel industry, okay, a lot more, and fine it and impose costs on it in order to make it repay the damage it's done to the environment in the past. So all that's going to help. If he cuts the military spending, is he going to repurpose that spending? I don't know what you mean by repurpose it. He's going to spend on the climate, okay, an environmental program. He's going to spend on the Green New Deal program as he outlined it. Okay? So he'll employ people in those particular programs, but he's not going to repurpose the military spending. He's going to end the militarism, and that's going to probably result in a 50% cut, okay, of the military budget. So instead of spending the 750 billion that we're spending now, or something very like it, we'll only be spending 375 billion a year. Similarly, the Homeland Security budget is going to shrink also. That's in various agencies, that's got to amount to 250 billion a year. That's in for drastic cuts also, because if we withdraw our troops from foreign lands, our blowback here is going to be a lot smaller, okay, than it now is, and we'll have to spend less on guarding against terrorism here. Uh, if he cuts military spending, he says that could possibly be a lot of job loss. I don't think the job loss is a problem, and the reason why I don't think it's a problem is because the people will be able to find jobs in the Green New Deal programs. Those are going to be going on all over the country, and if they can't find jobs there, they'll be able to find jobs in the federal job guarantee program. I mean, employing people isn't going to be a problem. The transition to a Green New Deal is going to be exhausting, and it's going to be comprehensive. And it's going to be a national effort that's going to occupy everybody in some way. One thing I'm not so sure about is his Social Security increase. He says it's going to increase by 1,300 a year, but for people making less than 16,000, well, he's got some ideas on Social Security expansion. Okay, that mean, first of all, that all people who are Social Security is less than the poverty line at this point, which is a large number of the people on Social Security are immediately going to have their Social Security increased. I think to something like, what is it? Is it 20% over the poverty line? Okay, I forget. Okay, exactly what he is, but he's talking a substantial increase in Social Security. Okay, for everybody, it's much more than 1,300 a year, Rob. I forget what the figure is. Uh, it probably is closer to 1,300 per month, but I think that people who now make something like 650 a month or 700 a month will probably end up with new rates in the neighborhood of 1,300 a month or 1,400 a month. But there'll be increases even for people who are now getting something like 1,700 a month, okay, or 1,800 a month. They too will be increased substantially, but not by the same amount as the lower level people. Also, I think there are likely to be increases in future years, okay, as well. In other words, that the first initial expansion of Social Security is going to be increased, is going to be further increased. Now, we don't know yet whether he's going to pass a basic income. I'm not talking about okay, a universal basic income now. I'm talking about a basic income for those okay, in need. And Rob says, I would call for the end of public private partnerships in public transportation services. No more profit in public transportation. I don't think that Bernie's plan actually says that, actually explicitly and right out. But when you look at the details of the plan, it certainly implies that the private aspect of public transportation is going to be severely cut back, as will the private sector's role in the internet. I think that's going to be severely cut back as well. Anything else, Rob? Well, I guess I'm going to have to say goodnight. It's getting late. Rob says no more for profit in public transportation. Okay, it's getting late, and I'll be a long time downloading this as it is so I can put it up okay, on YouTube. And he says the same goes for energy okay, and water. Yes, I think that's implied by the detail in Bernie's plan. Well, it looks like Steve has something coming on now. I suppose it's probably Steve. Uh, anyway, it's an RP person who's going to be streaming on Bernie's Green New Deal, and it's starting right now. So I am going to end what I have to say and free you up to go take a look at what RP has to offer. And I'll see you tomorrow night. I'll be on at 9 p.m. again to go over more of Bernie's Green New Deal plan, starting with uh, what's going to happen to the fossil fuel industry. ending the greed of the fossil fuel industry and holding them accountable. That will be the first subject discussed tomorrow. So please come, and hopefully I'll see you all tomorrow. And thanks for coming and for hanging in with me for so long. I'm now going to end.